Changes, a Generation X-based fic. Chapter 4, Understanding. Paige Guthrie entered the med lab just as Jono had finished telling Richard about the features. She had already been told by Sean about the incident that had happened, and she was prepared for anything that could happen. It was to be her task to show the new student the biosphere, or as some of the others called it, the Danger Grotto. This would also mean another encounter with penance. Inwardly, she hoped that a repeat of the incident in the assembly hall wasn't going to happen, but there was no guarantee on that. She stopped to think about that when she heard Jonah say, "I see Paige is here, so it's time for you to see the biosphere." She just nodded, and she noticed Richard smiled politely. She also noticed that he looked at Jonathan for a moment, but it passed quickly. She had sensed the sadness in Jonah's sigh voice. She wouldn't say, but she was sad about what had happened at her home. She was also upset about it, and that was foremost in her mind about that. The simple truth was that he had jumped to a conclusion that was totally false. She then motioned for Richard to follow her out of the med center. "Richard, I'm Paige Guthrie, and as Jono said, I'm going to be showing you the biosphere, or as some affectionately call it, the Danger Grotto." She was not surprised that he kept the same distance between her and him as he had with Jono. As they left the building, she heard him ask a very surprising question. So, who made the mistake of letting their mind or heart take control? Those words made Paige stop and turn in defense. She was shocked by what the question hinted at. Somehow Richard had learned about the relationship with Jono. She recalled that Richard briefly had his ability. She was just about to ask when she noticed that he had raised his hands. "Before you ask, I actually didn't pick up on that from Jonathan. He hasn't had such a traumatic life as penance. I sort of recognized the look of lost love. I'll admit I had the look before in my life, and most times it was my mind focusing on a life together that my heart knew wasn't right." At that moment, she saw him look down, as almost like he was embarrassed about what he was saying. After a few moments, she heard a slight, stern tone enter his voice. "However, I think in your case you both know it is right, but someone's mind said it was wrong. That's what caused the rift between you two." She knew it wasn't an accusation, so she calmed herself down. While it was a very personal topic, and he was new, he did hit the nail on the head. She sighed, mentally forgiving Richard for his statement. "You're right. It was Jonah who had thought it wouldn't work. I'm still a little upset about it, and really haven't talked about it with anyone. I had thought the only person who might have truly known was Miss Frost. When you said that, I thought that with your power—" She didn't finish the statement, knowing how bad it would sound. She could tell that he already knew what she had thought, but didn't seem upset. He had a sheepish look on his face. "It's all right. I completely understand. It can be hard to keep things from me, especially for a mutant. It's one of the things I hate about my power, since it makes it hard to keep friends." For a moment, Paige thought about where she was going to take him, and smiled. "It's okay. In fact, I think your ability might bring you more friends here than you thought. Now come on. You're about to enter the biosphere, where we relax and train." She then guided him to the building. As they made their way there, she heard him ask a question she figured was coming. Paige, I was just wondering what your mutant ability is. She took the question in stride, since it was better than him finding out her mutant power by using his own power. I'm a mammoth. I have the ability to transform myself into different substances just by shedding my skin. It's like having an instant armor. She glanced back as they reached the biosphere and saw him give a slight grin. That's a weird ability. I like it. She then opened the door and they entered. For a moment she soaked in the beauty of the place. It was nice to enjoy the place when there wasn't any training going on. She then heard him say, "Whoa, this place is a paradise. I bet Pennant spends a lot of time here." Paige nodded in agreement. "Yes, she does. In fact, I bet we'll run into her." She then paused for a moment and blinked, remembering what had happened earlier. She then looked at Richard, a bit concerned. "I hope that's not a problem, given what happened earlier." For a moment she turned to look at him, but he just smiled. "I doubt we'll have a repeat of that. For some reason, I think she'd rather have me as a friend." For a moment she noticed a thoughtful look on his face, as if he was trying to remember something. She sighed, thinking about how long Penance had been at the school, and that trying first day for her. "You are the first person who ever really communicated with her. Because of that, I think you might be a blessing for all of us here, but most of all her." She then stepped a little further into the biosphere. "Now, let me tell you a bit more about the biosphere." She cleared her throat and mentally went over her speech. She had been planning it out in her head the whole time, and she made sure it would be flawless. However, when she turned to deliver it, she noticed that Richard had stopped moving. She was about to ask why he stopped, and noticed that his skin was taking on the same traits as they had earlier. It didn't seem painful this time, but she noticed the reason. About 4 feet from him was Penance, and she had a very happy look on her face. She had anticipated Penance's arrival and held an apple in her hand. "I had a feeling you'd be here." She could tell Penance had noticed the apple, but the girl's attention was more on the new student. She held out the apple to Penance and watched as the redhead took notice. She held out her hand and Paige placed the apple in her hand. Just as the apple touched the hand, Paige watched as the apple was sliced into pieces. For a moment she felt sorry for Penance, but then watched as she held onto the pieces and offered some to Richard. In that brief moment, she heard Richard say something, obviously in the language that Richard spoke before. When she saw Penance smile and the two start to eat the slices, she realized that the biosphere lecture was not that important. What was important was getting Penance to communicate. The moment Richard realized Penance was nearby, he stopped. He could tell she was happy to see him. It was something he picked up on when she entered the range of his powers. He looked straight at her, and she came out. This time, he could see she moved with grace. When she stopped near him and Paige handed her an apple, he wondered what would happen next. He was pleasantly surprised when the redhead mutant held the slices in her hand and telepathically asked him, "Would you like some?" He nodded and thanked her aloud, which made her smile. For a moment he glanced at Paige, who seemed to be letting this interruption to her plans go on. He decided to take this chance to know the mutant girl that seemed to captivate his mind. So, Penance, is that the name everyone uses for you? She shook her head, and he could imagine that if her hair wasn't so rigid, it would have flown beautifully behind her. No, the one in the yellow jacket, Jubilee. She calls me Penny. She's always kind to me, like how a big sister should be. He thought about that for a moment. It seemed to fit as a shortened form of penance. But he could. But could that really be her name? If so, it would not be the first time a child had an unusual name. He decided he had to be sure. Is Penance really her name? He didn't feel surprised when she shook her head. No, my real first name is Yvette, but no one here knows that except you. In that moment, his mind flashed back to a long forgotten memory. It wasn't too clear, but the name sounded like one he heard before, when he was very young. He pushed the feeling of deja vu out of his mind. While the name sounded familiar, it was also a very lovely name. That's a lovely name. Would you mind if I called you that instead of Penny or Penance? At that moment he could have sworn she had blushed, but with her skin that red, it was hard to tell. After a moment, she answered his question. I'd like that. You know, you're the first person to ever communicate with me here. For a moment she fidgeted, as if she were recalling an unpleasant memory. He didn't want to pry into it, but something made him ask, since it seemed she had been at the school for a while. Didn't anyone else try? The way everyone has talked, they've been trying for a while. She nodded and then answered, Well, they did try, but even then I didn't feel totally safe with them. Since you knew my language, I felt safe. She fidgeted again and then continued, On my first days here, and since, the fiery one has spoken to me, but I never understood him. I have gotten the impression that the others don't want to hurt me, even though I had hurt her. She pointed over at Paige. He blinked at that news, and then looked at Paige before returning his gaze to Penance. You hurt Paige? Paige Guthrie? For a moment he hoped he had said the name correctly. He watched as Penance nod again. If that is her name, yes. None of them knew my native tongue. It was a pleasant surprise to find you understanding it. On my first days here, I had one thought on my mind. Flee. I had just been rescued from him, who had been hurting me in ways I don't want to dwell on right now. When I tried to flee from here, the Skin Ripper attacked me. I fought in self-defense. For a moment, Richard felt a brief second of levity would be called for. He gave a small smile and said, Note to self, don't get on your bad side. The comment caused her to giggle, and he wished he could have heard it audibly. After a moment, she stopped giggling and looked at him. You're funny. I hope you never run into him. In that instant, he felt a psychic shudder, and a fear almost overcame him. You might lose that, and your life. I'm still recovering from that, which is why I don't trust everyone here yet. The only one I did trust is Jubilee, but I couldn't talk to her. When you arrived and shown you could speak to me, I truly felt safe for the first time since him. He started to shudder now. He was recalling the incident at the airport, and after hearing Penance, then he mentally corrected himself. Hearing a vet, he needed to ask. That my mutant ability is what is allowing me to talk with you and use your abilities. When I arrived at the airport, I think he was there. You seemed to touch on a fear of mine with my ability that I'd lose myself to his personality. Is there anything you can tell me about him? For a moment he thought he had asked too much of her, as she shuddered from the thought. And then she answered, I'll tell you all I know. I had lost my family in the war in my homeland, and shortly after that, he took me. During that time, I almost lost myself to him. After a moment, she looked him in the eyes. I don't want to lose you to him. Richard felt his eyes go wide for a moment. Those words were telling him a lot, and part of him accepted those words for what they were. His ability to communicate with her was making her fall for him, and he honestly liked that. Yvette, did you just say what I think you said? He could tell she was trying to blush, if it was possible the way she was at the moment. Finally, she nodded. Yes, I do believe I have feelings for you. It might be a crush, but I think it's more. He blinked for a moment. He tried to form relationships in the past, and the latest girl to have shown him any affection proved to be anything but that. This, however, felt genuine, and he didn't want to give that up. He felt a smile cross his face, a wistful smile. Well, I hope it's more. My first day here, and not only am I getting a friend, but I'm getting a girlfriend. He saw a smile cross Yvette's face, and then he said, I'll stop by later on, and you can tell me about him then. I might even try to teach you some English. Our mental link might even speed the process up. He saw her eyes light up, realizing what that would mean. If we could do that, then I could talk with all of them. Jubilee, the noisemaker, his relation, the fiery one, the skin ripper, the one that extends his skin, the glowing man, the changer, and even the mind witch. Although I don't know how likely I'm going to want to, though. Then he saw a dreamy look cross her face. And most importantly, you. He was sure he had a dreamy look on his face when he responded, Then I'll see you here tonight. She then bounded off, and he could tell there was happiness in her movements. He then turned to look at Paige, who had a look of what could only be called perplexed amusement. He wondered what it was, but before he could even ask, he heard the sound of approaching people. And the only thing he could be certain of was that those approaching were kids. Franklin Richards raced through the biosphere with his friends, Artie and Leach, with him. Just a short time ago, he had seen the new person, Richard Cale, in the assembly hall. He had seen the unintentional demonstration of his powers, and he was sure that his friends would like him. When he saw where Paige was standing, he headed right over to the area. As they approached, he noticed Penance was bounding away, and he could tell that she was near Richard. His normally white skin had turned red. His hands were claw-like, and his hair was a shorter version of Penance's hair. At that moment, images appeared over Artie's head. The images were that of a number 2, a picture of Penance's face, and a question mark. The images were the boy's only way of communicating, as well as his mutant power. He wasn't sure how to respond to the image, but Paige just smiled at them. "No, Artie. Richard isn't a mutant like Penance. His ability allows him to mimic a mutant's abilities, personalities, as well as their knowledge." He was thankful that Paige understood what Artie was asking. and was even more surprised when she looked between them, and then to Richard. Richard, I don't know if you were formally introduced to Franklin, but this is Franklin Richards, and the two other younger students here, Artie and Leach. He watched as Richard turned to face them, and then wrote a message in the ground using his claw-like hands. Pleased to meet you all. My name is Richard, but you may call me Rich if you want. If you don't mind me asking, what are your powers? Franklin was stunned at the question, but then again, given his ability, it was probably a precaution. Before he could answer, he heard Leech answer in his usual way of speaking. Leech's ability to suppress other mutants' abilities. Artie's ability to project images. We good friends. He noticed Richard started blinking his eyes, as if his mind was trying to process something that didn't make sense. He looked at Richard and said, Leech always talks like that, but that sums up their powers. It's also why I like hanging out with them. His abilities keep my reality-altering powers in check. See, when I last used my powers, it was when I helped destroy Onslaught, and he stopped speaking, feeling the memory of the tragic event coming back. Those memories always made him feel sad. He then saw Paige walk over to him with a kind smile on her face. Don't worry, Franklin. They aren't gone, 'cause they're still in your heart. He then saw her turn towards Richard. His parents were Reed and Susan Richards of the Fantastic Four. He noticed Richard nod in understanding. Richard also looked like he did when he first saw him. He then watched as Richard neared him. I think I can understand what you might be going through. I didn't lose my parents, but I lost someone who was like a parent to me. When that happened, I held back the tears for 9 years. You need to let that pain out, or it will eventually eat you up inside. Franklin was quiet for a moment, as he thought about the words the new student at the school offered. I think I understand. He then smiled at Richard. I hope you will be staying here for a while. You'd be cool to have as a friend. For a moment he saw a surprised look cross Richard's face, soon to be replaced by a smile. The moment ended when he heard the voice of the headmaster. Well, now, Rich, I see you've met the lads. He hadn't even heard the headmaster arrive. He was grateful when the new student stood and nodded. It was a pleasure to meet them, Sean. Being the eldest of all my cousins, I guess I have a soft spot for kids. He then waited as the new student looked at Mr. Cassidy. So, what's next on the agenda? He saw a slight smile on Mr. Cassidy's face as he responded to the question. Well, lad, the students thought they would be a bit festive, and have planned a party. It's become a bit of a tradition, and better than new arrivals being plagued with problems. He then noticed a bit of a troubled look on Richard's face, as the new arrival just said, Oh dear. Well, I hope no one expects me to dance. I've never been one for those dances. The only dances I really like are the classical slow ones. He then watched as Mr. Cassidy just smiled and said, Well, lad, then you'll have to be a wallflower. If Jubilee picked out the music, I can bet nothing will be slow. Besides, I doubt you would want to slow dance with anyone. At that moment he saw a slight smile cross Richard's face. You might be right. You might be right. Well then, maybe I should prepare for this. Maybe freshen up a bit. He then noticed that Richard was looking right at him and the boys. Will you three be attending? He watched as Franklin looked at the others, and then after a moment, I think so. I do hope you enjoy it here at the school. He then ran off with Artie and Leech, back to the tree house. and then they would all head off to get ready for the party. Mondo looked around the room and smiled. It took a good deal of time, but he had set up the room to look the same way it had when he had his party. He knew Sean was bringing some of the food in, while Emma was just supervising. That was probably for the best, since everyone had said Emma's cooking wasn't the best in the world. After a few moments, he noticed that she was walking over to him, looking around the room. He could tell she was happy with the decor, since a smile was on her face. "Very well done, Mondo. You've really gotten the place into the spirit of celebration. I do hope Richard likes it." Mondo nodded in agreement. It seemed to him that Richard had preferred dark colors, which included the outfit he had on when he arrived. "I've done my best. To make it cheerful. It's odd, but that such a happy fellow like Richard prefers dressing in gloomy colors. It makes him appear to be depressed." However, it seemed to him that the attire is part of the way Richard was not totally what he seemed to be. He still wondered if Richard had truly researched the homeland of penance for a paper, but he did not think anything was sinister about it. It was a fortuitous coincidence. He was brought back to the moment when he saw Richard enter the room, obviously taking in the decorations. "Cheerful, but if a purple dinosaur jumps out, I'm leaving." He was confused by this statement, but thought it might have been a joke of some sort. He then saw Richard look at him, and the young man asked a question that should have had an obvious answer. "Is this a formal party or informal?" Mondo just spread out his arms, displaying his Hawaiian shirt. "Informal, just like my own. However, back then, they did get formally dressed. I just think a celebration should be informal." He watched as Richard nodded and smiled. "Cheerful is all well and good, but there are some times we must put cheerfulness aside. If you don't know when not to be cheerful, you may end up with a short life." He blinked at that comment, surprised by it. He was about to say something when Richard just smiled again. "Sorry if that bothered you. I've looked into several philosophies about life and find wisdom in what everyone said. I heard in one interview that a particular individual stated he played the hand life dealt him, or something to that effect. He may not have played it wisely, but who any of us can? We play the hand the best way we can. For all I know, my hand may lead me to do something against my nature, like hurt someone." He was stunned by that statement, but for some reason he thought about how true it would become if one of X's enemies attacked. However, the comment was also heard by Miss Frost, who just coolly said, "If you would even hurt one of my students, I would make you regret it." For a moment he could have sworn a cold chill passed through the room as he noticed that Richard registered the threat. "Miss Frost, if I did do that, I doubt I could live with myself. I don't lose my temper often, but those rare times I do, it is not a pleasant sight. Since I have a history of epilepsy, the medicine I take for it is known to cause mood swings. Those fits of anger have always ended in a crying episode, as my mind registers what I could have done to those around me. Trust me, Miss Frost, I do not want to put anyone through that." It was at that point that Richard turned to leave, and Mondo could have sworn the party would be ruined. At that moment, Mrs. Frost's icy demeanor dissolved, as a stunned look crossed her face. You are a sensitive person, aren't you? He nodded, and Miss Frost just smiled a sweet smile. I'm sorry for my reaction. I lost one set of students once, which is why I'm overprotective of this set. Again, Richard nodded, and he had stopped moving. Mondo then looked at Richard and asked, a question on his mind. If you are so sensitive, why do you wear such depressing colors? The answer he got was not what he expected. I like black, Mondo, but not for the reasons you think. Black is known to be depressing, but it is a color of mystery. When one looks into a totally dark room, one knows not what to expect. I also like to remain a mystery at times. There are things about myself I don't even know. That's another reason why I came here. To not only learn to control my power, but know my true self. Mondo nodded, and he was almost ready to ask a bit more, but the rest of the school started to arrive. Any more questions would wait, maybe until tomorrow. It seemed Rich's views would be interesting to find out on all matters.